parents made me pay rent at 18. My brother is 32 and still lives there for free. 2 weeks after I turned 18, my father sat me down at the dining room table with a printed sheet of paper that looked suspiciously like it had been formatted in Excel. It was a rent schedule. $300 a month due on the first, along with a grocery contribution and a share of the utilities, effective immediately, because, as he put it, you're an adult now and adults contribute. I didn't argue. I was 18, still in my last semester of high school, working a part-time job at a hardware store that paid $9 an hour. And somehow I still found the money every month because the alternative, disappointing my father, being labeled the ungrateful one, felt scarier than the financial strain itself. Remember doing the math that first month, laying out my paycheck on my bedroom floor in actual cash, separating it into piles for rent, gas, and whatever was left over for anything resembling a normal 18-year-old's life. There usually wasn't much left over. I stopped going out with friends as often, not because I didn't want to, but because $11 for a movie ticket started to feel like a real decision rather than a casual one. I paid rent through the rest of high school. I paid rent through 2 years of community college while I saved for a 4-year transfer, working weekend shifts on top of a full course load because the math simply didn't work otherwise. I paid rent even during the 6 months I was between jobs after graduating, when my father found out I'd missed a payment and left a sticky note on my door that just said, "See me." Like I was a student called to the principal's office instead of his son, navigating an unemployment gap in a rough job market. I remember standing in front of that door reading those 2 words over and over, feeling something in me quietly harden that never fully softened again, not toward him, not for a long time. My younger brother Tyler is 14 years younger than me, which meant that by the time he turned 18, I had already moved out, built a career in marketing, and started a life 2 hours away. I wasn't around for his 18th birthday, but I heard about it from my mother in a phone call a few weeks later, in the kind of casual, unremarkable tone she'd used to mention something about the weather. "Tyler's not going to worry about rent right now," she said. "He's focusing on figuring out his path. We want him to have room to explore before we start putting pressure on him." I remember sitting with that sentence for a long moment, waiting for the part where she explained why my path hadn't come with the same room to explore, why 18-year-old me had been handed an Excel spreadsheet, and a due date while 18-year-old Tyler was being handed patience and grace. That explanation never came, not that day, and not for years afterward, no matter how many times the subject came up. I told myself for a long time that it wasn't worth dwelling on. Tyler was the baby of the family, born when my parents were older, more financially comfortable, more relaxed than they'd been in their 30s raising me. Maybe that's just how it goes, I told myself. Parents evolve. Younger siblings get a softer version of the same people. I built a whole rationalization out of that idea, revisited it every time envy crept in, and mostly, for a while, it worked well enough to keep me from saying anything. I remember the exact moment that rationalization first started cracking, though it would take years for the crack to fully split open. I was 23, home for a weekend, and I found my father's old rent ledger, an actual physical notebook he'd kept, tracking every payment I'd made since I was 18, dates and amounts in his small, careful handwriting, spanning nearly 5 years of my life reduced to a column of numbers. Remember flipping through it in his home office while he was outside, feeling a strange mix of pride and hurt at the same time. Pride that I'd never missed a payment except that one gap he'd left the sticky note about. Hurt that this ledger existed at all, that my contributions to that household had been tracked with such precision while, even then, at 11 years old, Tyler wasn't expected to contribute a single line to any comparable page. I didn't say anything about the ledger that weekend. I put it back exactly where I found it and told myself again that it wasn't worth bringing up. I was getting good by then at telling myself that. It stopped working the year Tyler turned 25 and was still living at home, still not paying rent still, as far as I could tell, not meaningfully exploring his path in any direction beyond playing video games in his childhood bedroom and working an inconsistent schedule at a friend's car detailing business. I brought it up carefully during a visit home that Christmas, trying to frame it as concern rather than resentment, though I suspect some resentment leaked through no matter how carefully I tried to hide it. "Don't you think it might be good for Tyler to have some responsibility?" I asked my mother while we were alone doing dishes. "At his age, some rent, even a small amount, might push him to figure things out faster." "It's not you," my mother said, in a tone that suggested this was somehow supposed to end the conversation rather than open it further. "You were always more independent. Tyler needs a little more support to find his footing." "I was independent because I didn't have a choice," I said. "You gave me a rent schedule at 18. I found my footing because the alternative was falling flat on my face financially. Maybe Tyler would find his footing faster too if he had similar stakes." My mother didn't respond to that directly. She just changed the subject to a casserole recipe she wanted to try for New Year's, and I let it go because pushing further felt at the time like more effort than it was worth. It kept not being worth it, apparently, for another 7 years, though the resentment didn't stay quiet the entire time. It just found smaller, less confrontational outlets. I started keeping a mental tally of my own, an unofficial mirror of my father's old ledger, except mine tracked disparities instead of payments. The year my parents bought Tyler a used car for his 21st birthday, something I'd had to finance entirely myself at the same age. The summer they paid for his community college tuition outright while I was still paying off loans from mine. Countless small comments, dropped casually over holiday dinners, about how Tyler just needs a little more time to find himself. A phrase that had apparently never once been extended to me, not even during my 6-month unemployment gap, when the only grace I received was a sticky note asking to be reminded why my rent was late. Tyler is 32 now. He still lives in my parents' house. He still doesn't pay rent, doesn't contribute to groceries or utilities in any consistent way, and has cycled through what I've lost count of as somewhere between 6 and 8 jobs over the past decade. None lasting more than a year, most ending in some version of it, just wasn't the right fit. Breaking point came at a family dinner this past spring, one I'd driven 2 hours to attend, where my father, apparently feeling generous with unsolicited financial advice that evening, decided to critique a car purchase I'd made the previous month. "That seems like an unnecessary expense," he said, looking at photos of the car on my phone that my mother had asked to see. "You should be saving more aggressively at your age. Homeownership doesn't happen by accident." I want to be honest that something in me just snapped at that specific moment, not because the comment itself was so egregious on its own, but because of everything it was sitting on top of: 14 years of rent payments starting at 18, a sticky note on my door during an unemployment gap, a decade of watching my brother live completely free while I was lectured about fiscal responsibility from the same table where I'd once been handed a spreadsheet. Set my phone down carefully, giving myself a second to decide whether I actually wanted to open this door tonight or let it pass the way I'd let it pass so many times before. I thought about the ledger in my father's office, the one I'd found 9 years earlier and quietly put back exactly where it belonged. I thought about Priya's comment in the car after some other holiday, about how she could tell this ate at me even when I insisted it didn't. And I thought mostly about the version of myself at 18, sitting at this same table, being handed a printed spreadsheet like it was simply the natural order of things, never once told that his younger brother would eventually be handed nothing at all, indefinitely, without explanation. I decided in that pause that I was done letting it pass. "I can afford this car," I said, "because I've been managing my own finances independently since I was 18 years old, which you made sure of personally, with a rent schedule and a due date. Meanwhile, Tyler is 32 and hasn't paid a cent toward this house in his entire adult life. Maybe before critiquing my spending, it's worth asking why one of your sons has 14 years of financial independence under his belt and the other doesn't have a single year of it." The table went quiet in the specific way tables go quiet when someone says the thing everyone has been avoiding for over a decade. "That's not fair," my father said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Tyler's situation is different." "How exactly is it different?" "He struggled more in school. He's had a harder time finding his direction." "I struggled too," I said. "I struggled with money every single month because you decided, when I was 18, that struggling was character building. Somehow that lesson never made it to Tyler. Somehow he gets 14 extra years of the safety net you decided I didn't need." Tyler, sitting across the table, looked genuinely uncomfortable for maybe the first time in this entire long-running arrangement. "I didn't ask for this," he said quietly. "Mean I'm grateful, obviously, but I didn't sit down and demand free rent for 14 years. It's just what they offered me." "I believe you," I said, and I meant it. "This was never really about you, Tyler. It's about the fact that Mom and Dad made 2 completely different sets of rules for their kids and never once explained why, and definitely never once apologized for how unfair the difference actually was." My mother tried the same deflection she'd used at Christmas years earlier. "You've done so well for yourself. Isn't that its own reward? It shouldn't have to come at the cost of feeling punished for being independent," I said, "while Tyler gets rewarded for staying dependent. That's not a lesson about resilience. That's just an inconsistency you've never had to answer for because I never made you answer for it before tonight." My mother tried a different tactic then, one I hadn't anticipated. "You know your father and I aren't as young as we used to be," she said. "Part of why we haven't pushed Tyler is that we like having him around. The house feels less empty. Is that so terrible?" It was, I realized in that moment, maybe the most honest thing either of my parents had said all evening, and also somehow the thing that stung the most. Not because wanting company in an aging, quieting house was inherently wrong, but because it meant the 14-year discrepancy between Tyler's arrangement and mine had never really been about character building or independence lessons at all. It had been about convenience, dressed up in language about resilience when it served their narrative for me, and dressed up in language about patience when it served their comfort with Tyler. I had built my entire adult identity, in part, around a lesson I now understood might have simply been a byproduct of my parents needing an empty room and a lighter grocery bill when I was 18, nothing more noble than that. "That might be the most honest thing said at this table tonight," I said quietly. "But it doesn't change the fact that you let me believe for 14 years that what I went through was about building character, when apparently it was just as much about what worked for you at the time. Nobody had a clean response to that. My father eventually mumbled something about reconsidering the arrangement going forward, which felt in the moment like too little arriving 14 years too late. But I let it sit there anyway, because I wasn't sure what more I actually wanted from that specific dinner beyond finally saying the thing out loud. The weeks after that dinner were tense. My mother called twice, mostly to express hurt that I'd embarrassed the family by bringing up money at the table, a framing that told me she'd absorbed almost none of the actual point I'd been making. My father, to his credit, called once separately, and admitted in a stiffer, more clipped version of an apology than I'd been hoping for, that he probably could have handled things more evenly between his sons. My wife Priya had been quiet through most of the drive home from that dinner, letting me process out loud without interrupting, until we were about an hour from our apartment, and she finally spoke. "I've been watching you carry that for the entire 3 years I've known you," she said. "The car, the loans, all of it. I always wondered why you never just said something. I'm glad you finally did, even if it took 14 years to get there." Hadn't realized, until she said it, how visible that particular resentment had apparently been to the person closest to me, even during years when I thought I'd successfully buried it under rationalizations about younger siblings and evolving parents. It made me wonder what else I'd been carrying quietly enough to convince myself it wasn't showing, while everyone paying close attention could see it plainly the whole time. Tyler, unexpectedly, was the one who reached out with the most self-awareness. Called me a week later, sounding more grounded than I'd heard him in years, and told me he'd started looking at apartments, that the dinner had made him realize how stuck he'd let himself get, comfortable in a way that had quietly cost him any real sense of urgency about his own life. "I don't think Mom and Dad did me any favors," he said. "I think I've basically been coasting since I was 18 and nobody ever made me stop." I asked him carefully if he resented me for finally saying something at that dinner, for putting a spotlight on an arrangement that had let him stay comfortable for so long. He was quiet for a moment before answering. "Honestly, no. I think some part of me has known for years that something was off about it. It's easier to coast than to question why you're allowed to. You kind of forced the question, and I needed that, even if it didn't feel great in the moment." Hearing him say that mattered more to me than I expected it to. I'd worried, in the days after that dinner, that I'd become the villain of his story the same way I'd apparently become an unspoken measuring stick he'd never asked to be compared against. Instead, it seemed like the conversation had cracked something open for both of us, in different ways, at the same table, after 14 years of neither of us fully understanding the other's side of it. I don't know if Tyler will actually follow through on moving out, and I've decided that's not really my responsibility to manage either way. Last I heard, he'd put down a deposit on a small one-bedroom about 20 minutes from our parents' place, close enough to still see them regularly, far enough to finally start building something that belongs entirely to him. My mother mentioned it to me almost sheepishly during a phone call, as if she wasn't sure how I'd react to news that, 14 years too late, Tyler was finally starting the independent life I'd been handed on a spreadsheet the moment I turned 18. Priya and I talked, a few weeks after that dinner, about whether I regretted saying anything at all, whether I wished I'd just let another holiday pass in polite silence the way I had for over a decade. I told her I didn't regret it, not even the awkward months that followed, not even my mother's insistence that I'd embarrassed the family by bringing money into a dinner conversation. What I regretted, if anything, was waiting 14 years to say something that probably should have been said, gently, somewhere around year 3 or 4, before the resentment had time to calcify into something so heavy it needed an entire dinner table confrontation to finally surface. My relationship with my parents is different now, quieter in some ways, more honest in others. We don't pretend the 14-year gap didn't happen, and we don't dress it back up as a character-building exercise either. My father actually apologized properly, eventually, over coffee, just the two of us, admitting that the rent schedule at 18 had less to do with teaching me independence and more to do with tight finances in a specific stretch of years that had long since passed by the time Tyler came of age, a distinction he'd never once bothered explaining to me while I was living inside the consequences of it. What matters most to me now is that the conversation finally happened, out loud, at a table where it had been avoided for 14 years. I stopped assuming that silence about unfairness is the same thing as acceptance of it. Sometimes it's just patience running out slower than it probably should have, waiting for a moment honest enough to finally hold the whole weight of it.